3 meters. That's how close the Filipino operator stood. Close enough to smell diesel on the Russian wetsuits. Close enough to hear the soft click of a safety switch. And yet, the Russian Naval Special Forces team, men trained for Arctic darkness and steel corridors, never saw him. He didn't rush, he didn't speak, he just waited, letting the jungle swallow his outline until their confidence hardened into certainty. Then, in calm, accented Russian, he whispered 2 words that turned the night inside out. "You're tagged." In that moment, Russia came to teach, and the Philippines became the lesson.
Before we go any further, a quick note. This documentary story is fictional, created for educational and entertainment purposes only. Names, units, events, constructed to explore strategy, mindset, and adaptation. But the emotions, the pressure, the way nature can humble technology, that part is real in every environment where humans test limits. And in this story, the environment isn't just a backdrop, it's the main character. Because what happened next wasn't a simple joint exercise. It became a quiet showdown between 2 philosophies of elite warfare: dominate the terrain or disappear into it. It begins with a request that sounded impossible on paper. In late 2019, after a string of failed training evaluations in tropical conditions, a Russian naval reconnaissance unit, nicknamed in whispers as Sea Ghosts, sent an unusual message through back channels of international cooperation. Not a demand, not a negotiation, a request: help us survive the jungle. Their planners had studied maps and climate data, even commissioned new gear, but their performance reports repeated the same word like a verdict: visible. In the tropics, they were loud, slow, and exposed. They needed instructors who didn't merely operate there, who belonged there. The meeting point was a humid coastal base outside Subic, where air tastes like salt and rain. The Russian team arrived with crates, thermal scopes, encrypted radios, compact drones, precision optics sealed against water. Their leader, Captain Viktor Sokolov, carried himself like a man who had fought darkness most people never see. He was polite, controlled, almost cold. Across from him stood Commander Raul Apo Ibarra of the Philippine Naval Special Operations, lean, sun-darkened, eyes that scanned without looking obvious. Their handshake was firm, their smiles were professional, but the silence between them said the truth. This was not a friendly tour. This was a test. The exercise plan was simple enough to sound harmless. 2 teams, 1 mission area, 48 hours. Infiltrate through mangrove swamps, push into triple canopy jungle, reach a marked objective, extract unseen. The Russians insisted on standard evaluation criteria. The Filipinos agreed, but added 1 line, quietly, like a signature at the bottom of a contract. Environmental rules apply. Captain Sokolov asked what that meant. Commander Ibarra only replied, "The jungle has its own standards. You will feel them." Then he turned and walked away, as if the forest itself had called his name.
At first, the Russians moved beautifully. Precise spacing, sharp hand signals, gear disciplined and minimal. Their boots were new, their packs balanced, their eyes trained. The drones rose like quiet insects and mapped the tree line. Their thermal optics painted the night in ghostly shapes. In open terrain, they would have been terrifying, but as they crossed into the mangroves, the world changed. The ground became alive, sucking mud, water channels, roots like traps. Their silent steps became wet slaps, their radio whispers turned into urgent checks, and above them, the canopy thickened until satellites became myths.
By hour 4, the Russians were sweating through layers designed for cold seas. Mosquitoes found the gaps in gloves, heat fogged optics. Their drone feed flickered, confused by the uniform texture of green. Captain Sokolov kept calm, repeating the same phrase, "We adapt." But adaptation is not a slogan, it's a language. And the jungle doesn't speak in words, it speaks in consequences. Meanwhile, the Filipino team had already disappeared, not moved ahead, disappeared. Their trackers went quiet, their footprints stopped. It was as if the forest had erased them with a single breath.
That night, the Russians set a perimeter like a textbook diagram, overlapping fields of view, thermal scans every minute, trip lines, quiet rotations. Sokolov trusted systems. Systems had kept him alive in shipboard raids and winter infiltrations. At 0211, one sentry noticed a disturbance, barely a change in shadow, a faint movement where there should be none. He raised his hand to signal, and that's when he felt warm breath near his ear. Not a shout, not a threat, a whisper that sounded almost disappointed. Too much metal, too much noise. The sentry froze. The voice continued. You would be gone.
The sentry spun, rifle up. Nothing. The thermal scope saw nothing. The night vision revealed only leaves and darkness. The trip lines remained untouched. The perimeter looked perfect, yet it had been breached. Captain Sokolov woke to the report and felt something unfamiliar. Not fear, but insult. Elite teams don't get walked through. He ordered a full sweep, drones launched, lasers traced, everything searching for a human outline. The jungle gave them a cruel answer. Silence. No footsteps, no heat signature, no radio ping, just insects and distant water. The Filipinos had delivered the message and vanished like a rumor.
At dawn, Sokolov made a decision that would later become the turning point of the entire exchange. He walked to the Filipino command post and requested a meeting. No pride, no excuses. My men are trained, he said, but the environment is winning. We came for help. So tell me the truth. What are we missing? Commander Ibarra didn't celebrate. He didn't mock. He just nodded slowly, as if he'd been waiting for that sentence. You brought the ocean into the jungle, he said. Different physics, different rules. Your tools are good. Your instincts are wrong.
The Filipinos led the Russians to a small clearing that didn't look like a clearing because it was disguised to appear accidental. Ibarra crouched and touched a leaf. "Listen," he said. At first, the Russians heard nothing but noise, birds, insects, wind. Then Ibarra pointed, a specific rhythm in the cicadas, a sudden pause in one corner, a tiny change that meant something had moved there recently. "The jungle tells on you," he said, "but it also tells on others. You don't need more equipment, you need more attention." Captain Sokolov watched his men listening harder than they ever listened to radios.
Lesson 1 was movement, because speed in the jungle isn't about pushing forward, it's about not fighting. The Russians had been forcing paths, bending branches, stepping heavy, choosing straight lines. The Filipinos showed them the opposite. Read the ground like a map, follow animal trails, use natural gaps, step where roots cradle your foot. A Filipino instructor moved 50 meters through dense brush without a sound. When he finished, his breathing was calm, his clothing barely disturbed. A Russian operator tried. He snapped twigs, snagged straps, cursed under his breath. Ibarra didn't scold. He simply said, "You move like you're angry."
Lesson 2 was time. Russians measured time by watches and schedules. Filipinos measured time by temperature shifts, by insect volume, by the way shadows thinned and thickened. Here, Ibarra said, the jungle has clocks. He showed them how certain birds appear near water in late afternoon, how ants change direction before rain, how the air's smell warns of humidity spikes. It sounded mystical until it proved practical. When the Russians tried to push during a rising heat window, their stamina dropped fast. When they followed the Filipino rhythm, they moved farther with less exhaustion. Their bodies didn't become stronger, their timing became smarter.
Lesson 3 was camouflage, but not the kind printed in factories. The Russians wore high-end tropical patterns, scientifically designed, sharp and expensive. The Filipinos asked one Russian operator to stand 10 meters away. "Freeze," they said. The group instantly found him, even without optics. "Your shape is human," Ibarra explained. "Your skin reflects. Your gear makes angles." Then a Filipino operator stepped into brush, applied dark mud to exposed skin, softened straps with cloth, attached local leaves in a way that broke symmetry. He went still. The Russians stared. One asked, "Where is he?" Ibarra smiled. "He is there. Your eyes just haven't learned how to see."
Lesson 4 was sound discipline, and it shocked the Russians most. They believed silence was controlled by moving slowly. The Filipinos taught a deeper truth. Silence is controlled by what moves. Leaves rustle differently than fabric. Branches snap differently than bone. Human sound has an unnatural rhythm. So the Filipinos trained them to move in micro-pauses, matching wind patterns, stepping when a bird call peaks, shifting weight during natural noise spikes. It felt ridiculous at first, like dancing to a rhythm nobody else heard. But the jungle is a choir, and the Filipinos knew exactly when to sing and when to vanish between notes.
On day 4, the Russians demanded a retest, not because they believed they'd mastered it, but because pride needed proof. The new scenario, a capture-the-flag objective at a ridgeline, with the Filipinos acting as the unseen defenders. The Russians planned an elegant approach, 2 elements flanking, drone overhead, thermal scanning forward. Commander Ibarra allowed it. Then he asked one question: "Do you want to win with your tools or with your bodies?" Captain Sokolov replied, "Both." Ibarra nodded. "Then today you learn the most painful lesson. Tools don't matter if you don't understand what they're seeing."
At 23:40, the Russians moved. Their drone hovered, feeding a clean image. No movement. Their thermal showed scattered heat, animals, warm rocks, patches of exposed ground. "Clear," said the operator. Then the drone feed stuttered. Not a total failure, just a faint distortion, like mist touching the lens. In the jungle, mist is normal. The Russians accepted it. What they didn't know was that the Filipinos had started a small, controlled smoke source far away, thin enough to blend with humidity, thick enough to confuse sensors. It wasn't about tricking technology. It was about reminding technology that nature doesn't stay still for scanning. The Russians reached the ridgeline and paused. They scanned again. Still nothing. They advanced, and then tap. A gentle touch on Captain Sokolov's shoulder, light as a leaf falling. He spun. No one. His heart hit his ribs like a warning bell. Another tap, this time on the last man in the file. Another Russian turned and raised his weapon, but his barrel pointed at emptiness. Suddenly, a small flashlight flicked on from behind a tree, revealing a Filipino instructor holding a piece of cloth like a referee. "Tagged," he said calmly. "All of you. You walked through us." The Russians didn't speak. They just stared, dumbfounded.
In the after-action debrief, no one yelled. That's what made it heavy. Sokolov sat with his hands clasped, replaying every choice. "How did you get behind us?" he asked. Ibarra pointed to the map and traced their route. "You moved in a line," he said. "A line is predictable, and you looked where you expected danger. Front, front, front. But in the jungle, danger isn't in front, it's everywhere." He tapped the ridge's side slope. "We didn't chase you," he said. "We waited where you were always going to be." Then he added softly, "You are brave, but bravery is loud. Here, quiet wins."
The next week, the roles fully reversed. The Russians stopped trying to complete the mission fast. Instead, they trained like students. They practiced stillness until their muscles shook. They learned to soften their silhouettes. They taped down gear that rattled. They learned to treat every step as a decision. The Filipinos didn't teach by speeches, they taught by demonstrations that embarrassed ego without insulting dignity. One Russian operator, Alexei Morozov, started improving quickly. He wasn't the strongest, but he was the most curious. "In the ocean," he told Ibarra, "we read currents." Ibarra nodded. "Exactly. Now read green currents." And for the first time, Morozov smiled like he'd found familiar logic in unfamiliar terrain.
Then came the real twist, the moment that made everyone at the base stop treating the training as routine. A storm rolled in faster than predicted, dropping rain so heavy it turned the jungle into moving water. The river near the extraction route swelled beyond safe crossing. The plan was to delay, but a radio message arrived from Coastal Command. A simulated crisis scenario would continue anyway. In other words, the exercise would not pause for weather. That's when the Filipinos looked at the Russians and asked a question that sounded like a challenge and an invitation at once. "Do you want to learn the jungle, or do you want to fight it?"
Captain Sokolov chose learning. The Filipinos led them away from the river, deeper into terrain that seemed worse. Thicker brush, steeper ground, less visibility. The Russians hesitated. "This is slower," someone muttered. Ibarra replied, "It's safer." They moved along a high line where runoff drained fast. They used bamboo for balance across mud-slick slopes. They found natural breaks in the canopy that reduced rain impact. And they made camp under a formation of trees that acted like a roof. The Russians were shocked, not because it was comfortable, but because it was possible. Their doctrine would have avoided this route. Filipino instinct treated it like the obvious answer.
That night, the Filipinos taught survival not as extra skills, but as operational power. They showed how to collect rainwater without exposing positions, how to keep fire heat low, how to eat without leaving obvious scent trails, how to rest in a way that still maintains awareness. For the Russians, the biggest surprise wasn't the techniques, it was the philosophy behind them. The jungle isn't a place you visit, it's a place you negotiate with. And negotiation requires respect. In the low glow of a covered ember, Sokolov admitted something he'd never said aloud. "We thought we were elite everywhere, but elite is relative. In your home, you are the masters." On the final evaluation day, they ran one last scenario, this time with a twist. The Russians would infiltrate, the Filipinos would track them, and the goal was not to win, but to see how long the Russians could remain unseen. The Russians moved slowly, quiet, almost humble. They used pauses, they avoided straight lines, they stopped trying to conquer distance. Hours passed. Then something remarkable happened. The tracking team began to struggle. Not fail, Filipinos rarely fail in their environment, but struggle. The Russians were improving. They weren't invisible yet, but they were no longer obvious. And in elite training, that shift is an earthquake. At 4:17, the tracking team found the first hint. A leaf turned the wrong way, a broken fern stem too fresh, a tiny scent pattern that didn't belong. They followed it.
The Russians sensed pursuit and adapted, splitting in a way that wasn't textbook but was smart because it followed terrain flow. For a brief moment, both teams were hunting and being hunted, reading and rewriting the jungle story in real time. Then, as dawn arrived, the Filipinos did what they always did. They ended the test the way they began it. A Filipino operator appeared 3 meters from the Russian hide site, standing calmly like he'd been there all night. He raised a hand. Tagged, he said, but this time he sounded impressed.
In the closing briefing, the Russian team presented a small gift, a patch from their unit placed carefully on the table. Not as payment, Sokolov said, as respect. The Filipinos responded with something even more meaningful, a simple woven band made from local plant fibers, light, plain, and strong. This is not a trophy, Ibarra told them. It's a reminder. In the jungle, you don't win by having more. You win by needing less. The Russians didn't laugh. They understood. Because in 48 humid hours, they'd learned what cold seas had never taught them. The most dangerous warrior isn't the one with the sharpest tools. It's the one who blends into the world like a shadow.
Back in Russia, the official report read like a technical document. Movement efficiency, sensor performance, environmental constraints. But inside the unit, the story spread differently. It became a quiet legend told to new recruits. There's a place, instructors would say, where your best gear becomes heavy, your best habits become noisy, and your confidence becomes a beacon. They didn't mention the Philippines by name every time, but they didn't need to. The lesson had a shape. A man standing 3 meters away, unseen. A whisper in a foreign language. The realization that nature can erase you if you don't belong. And belonging isn't purchased. It's trained, earned, and lived. Some months later, Captain Sokolov sent Commander Ibarra a short message. No big speeches, just a single line. We changed our program. Attached was a photo of Russian operators training in a simulated jungle facility, practicing stillness, moving with micro-pauses, studying plant patterns like students of biology. The Filipinos didn't respond with pride. They responded with a promise. Return any time. Because that's the strangest part of this story. Its power wasn't in humiliation, it was in humility. Two forces from opposite ends of the world finding a shared truth. Effectiveness is not ego. Effectiveness is learning fast, adapting faster, and respecting what you cannot control.
If you ask Filipino operators what made the difference, they won't say we're better. They'll say something simpler. We live here. And if you ask the Russians what shocked them most, they won't talk about mud camouflage or hidden shelters. They'll talk about the moment their technology showed nothing, and yet the threat was right beside them. Because that's a special kind of dumbfounded, when your instruments tell you you're safe, but reality proves you wrong. The jungle isn't impressed by budgets, it's impressed by awareness. And awareness can't be bought, it can only be built.
So, here's the takeaway beyond the lens was made for. There's a version of elite that the world rarely sees. Not loud, not flashy, not expensive. It's quiet mastery, environmental fluency, disciplined patience, the ability to become part of a place instead of trying to dominate it. In this fictional story, Russia came seeking help, and what happened next rewired how they understood their own identity. The Filipinos didn't give them secrets, they gave them a mirror. And in that mirror, the Russians saw a truth that applies far beyond the jungle. When the world changes, you either learn its language or you become a headline someone else narrates.